What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my least favorite game mechanics. That said, I tend to cover single-player CRPGs or RPGs in general, and as such, at least a few of the things on this list are kind of specific to that. So if this is the first video of mine you're watching, maybe keep that in mind. The other thing I want to mention at the beginning of the video, though, is that I think in the case of a lot of these mechanics, they can be done in a way that isn't as bad, while still achieving the same effect, and I'll probably talk about some of that as I go through them, at least where it's applicable. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing and talk about some of the things in gaming that make me sigh almost immediately. Now, first up, and probably the most relatable, timers. I hate timers in games. They annoy me, and if anything, I find that they tend to make games more tedious than anything. Nonetheless, timers do kind of attempt to provide some sort of immediacy to a plotline, as oftentimes a plot will be presented as super important and requiring action like right now, and then you go off doing side quests for like 40 hours. So I understand why developers want to implement these timers, and I think there are better ways to do it than just like a straight up countdown. And 2 of my favorite examples of this are actually from the Pathfinder games. Big surprise, right? I play a lot of Pathfinder if you're new to the channel. But believe it or not, I have examples from Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous for this. Kingmaker is probably the worst for having really bad timers, but it does have one example of a way to handle them in a really cool way, and that is in Act 5. You're given a choice between doing one thing or another, and then the plot kind of shifts depending on which one you do first. That is a way to apply a timer to something without just giving it a straight up countdown, which is what the actual day counter of the rest of Kingmaker is. Now, Wrath of the Righteous also handles this in an interesting way, where most of the quests have a timer for the act that you are in. Some of them do carry across acts, but the journal will actually show you a red hourglass indicating that that quest expires if you finish the act that you are currently working on, which I think is also a solid way of doing it because it's at least upfront about you failing it if you move past a certain point. Just right there are some cool ways you can implement timers, but the way they are typically done with just a straight countdown is honestly just annoying, and I hate it so much. But that brings us to number 2 on our list, and that is card mechanics. Unless your game is literally a card game, don't put card mechanics in it. Now, you see this a lot in turn-based RPGs, which is where I usually encounter it, and it almost immediately puts me off. And that tends to be because more often than not, the combat revolves around it in some way, and there's this sort of artificial deck building thing attached to the actual turn-based tactical combat, and I'm just not a fan. I'd rather have a system built around me just having the abilities rather than having to deal with this random, I don't know what I'm going to be able to do in any given encounter, really. And in games that typically prioritize strategy and tactics, implementing a mechanic where a character might not have the same abilities from encounter to encounter is very annoying to me, and thus never really been a fan. Now, that brings us to number 3 on the list, and this is fetch quests. Like a couple other things on this list, there's a right way and a wrong way to do these. The wrong way is typically what people are referring to when they talk about fetch quests, and that is where it's literally sending the player character to go gather like 10 of a plant or something, and then bring it back. Now in MMOs, this is a bit more acceptable, if you will, because of the nature of the game itself. However, in a single player game, no one wants to do this. They don't even really want to do it in MMOs, but they especially don't want to do it in a single-player game, because that quest teaches you nothing and rewards you with next to nothing most of the time. Now, in some instances, this is done in a sort of collectible fashion, and the reward might be worth it if you get all of something or something like that, which is probably worth mentioning. But another thing that I wanted to mention in regards to this is that if the thing you are fetching is like the plot MacGuffin, and it's less about the item, but rather the journey to get there, I think that makes sense. Even if you could really boil that down to a fetch quest. It's still teaching you something about the game, or at least encountering other areas of the game for you to learn more about the lore and the history of everything that's going on, that type of stuff. But if I see fetch quests that just do not advance the plot in any way, I find it quite tedious and annoying. And if a game absolutely has to have fetch quests for some reason, then at least make those quests and side quests in general teach the player something about the world. because otherwise it's not really a fun time and could easily be cut and make pretty much zero difference to the game. Next up on our list is a bit exclusive to games where you manage a party, and in games like that, which encompasses most CRPGs really, anytime I play a game where if the main character dies, it's game over, not a fan. Now, I don't think it's the end of the world here, but in general, especially when it comes to games that like have a clear rules set of like resurrection and everything, it becomes a little tedious, frankly. Now, it's never really stopped me from playing any games, which is why I put up with it in one of my favorite games, Wrath of the Righteous. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me that I couldn't just use the other party members to wrap up this fight. The thing I really don't like about this is that it kind of forces you into playing a little defensively with that character. Not necessarily speaking, especially in CRPGs, in a lot of cases there's ways to solo games, but nonetheless it can kind of feel like the game is forcing you to protect this one character at all costs, which is usually more annoying than fun. And again, this one has probably bothered me less than a lot of the other ones on this list, as usually games with party mechanics typically have so many options that it's easily worked around, but nonetheless, something about it just feels off, and I've never really liked it much. And that brings us to our final entry on the list, and this is the one I like to call losing a party member, as there's no real easy way to sum this up, but some games, when you play through them, due to plot reasons, will have you suddenly lose a main party member that you've been using for the entire game, which then completely kind of throws your party into disarray because now I'm trying to make up for the loss of a companion that I was using heavily, in some cases having to bring in a less desirable character that does a similar thing, who might have been lower level because I was using the other one. To give a recent example of this, I was playing the Diofield Chronicle and you lose one of the important characters, who is likely the first person of that class that you get, which means you probably haven't been leveling up the other one. So you lose a character that plays an important role in your party, and then suddenly you're having to deal with this less qualified person, let's say. Now, even in this instance, I do think there's a right way of doing this, and that is simply provide a replacement that does a similar thing at the very least. It doesn't have to be exact, but just give me someone who can fulfill the role of the person you are taking away. And furthermore, make sure you give me that character's equipment back. Now, giving the equipment back is something more recent games have gotten pretty good about doing, but a lot of games will just kind of take this character from you and leave you kind of high and dry in terms of messing up your party composition a bit. And much like the rest of this list, it's not a good time. But that is all I've got for you guys today. 5 game mechanics that honestly I'm just not very fond of, even if they don't necessarily ruin an experience. But all of that said, I certainly hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. We are growing every day, and I truly can't thank you enough. So thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.